Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to the fifth session in our CWSRF funding process virtual workshop series on what types of projects are eligible for CWSRF funding. My name is Kristen Crew from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through a request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can get started. I would like to introduce our presenters for today, Haley Hadjick and Shannon Sloan Pepper. Both are research scientists from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. Welcome, and I will hand it over to you.
Are you able to see my screen, Kristen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thanks. Great. Thanks, Kristen, for that intro. First talking here with you today is Shannon Sloan Pepper. And I'm just going to go over really quick. This is one episode in a series on the Clean Water State Revolving Funds. If you've attended one of these sessions before, welcome back. And if you're new, note that this is the fifth webinar in this series. We intend to have one webinar a month for the rest of the year. And you can find these webinars and webinar dates on the EFCN website. We'll go over that at the very end of this presentation. To view past recordings, all webinars before this have been recorded. You can view those recordings on our website by hitting the Training and Events tab at the top of our site, finding the Clean Water SRF series, and then in each webinar tab or page is a list of the previous webinars and those recordings, so you can download the recordings and download the slides as well as view those recordings. Next slide. So an overview of this particular workshop, we're going to give a quick introduction to the Clean Water SRF, just in case you're new to this series or would like a little refresher. That will only take a few minutes. Then we'll jump right into project eligibilities, which is probably why most of you are here today. We'll go through the different kinds of eligibilities, what section of the Clean Water Act they fall under, and we'll also briefly touch on projects that are generally ineligible for Clean Water State Revolving Fund money. We'll go through additional programs and eligibilities, and then we'll point you towards some resources that you can follow up on yourself. We will also be addressing questions at the end of this presentation. We're going to try to leave about 10 minutes. We'll see how that goes. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to drop them in the chat. And if we can't get to them during the webinar, we will follow up with you afterward, or we'll do our best to follow up with you afterward. So please do engage, ask questions. And if we don't get to you right away, we'll follow up with you later. Next slide. Okay, so first we're just going to give a quick introduction to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. What is it? Who is it for? Why does it exist? Next slide. So the State Revolving Fund, go ahead and next slide that as well, thank you. So as most of you probably know, wastewater infrastructure is really expensive. It costs a lot of money, especially traditional wastewater infrastructure. We're thinking about pipes and pumps and storage tanks. This is a high capital project generally to repair these things, and most systems have a really hard time funding this type of repair on just their user rates alone. Next. Hence, we have the EPA construction grants program that came to be in 1985. It's a grants program, so it's a federal program that gives money directly to states. They use it to fund their wastewater infrastructure. However, next, this is not a terribly sustainable way to fund infrastructure repairs because it is a one-time fund, it's a grant, that money never comes back. Next. So there was a need to develop some way to have a fund that will continually be inundated with funds without a ton of federal intervention, and thus the State Revolving Fund is born. Next slide. So the Clean Water State Revolving Fund started with the Clean Water Act amendments of 1987. And it's important to note here, this is a presentation obviously focused on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund is formed by a different founding legislation. That's the State Drinking Water Act of 1974. And that it's important to note this because that difference in the founding documents does mean that these are two really different programs. And so today we're focused on the Clean Water Act, but make sure that you understand that these are two really different programs, the Clean Water versus the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So Clean Water deals with wastewater and stormwater issues, drinking water obviously with drinking water issues. Next slide. So the 51 Clean Water SRF programs function like environmental infrastructure banks. They provide low interest loans to eligible recipients for their, wastewater, in this case, infrastructure and stormwater infrastructure projects. So the way it works is it's kind of continuously revolving. The SRF loan is originally funded through federal EPA grants, goes to each state, and then the state awards those funds to different recipients. The recipient repays the loan with very low interest. Then that fund is replenished. There's a new loan that goes out to a new project, and so on and so forth. So in this way, the fund is a little bit more sustainable than if it was a pure grants program. Next slide. Again, 51 programs, and so that's all 50 states, including Puerto Rico, have a Clean Water State Revolving Fund program. And each of these programs follows a similar set of federal regulations. However, each state really gets to decide what they want to do with their own funds. And this is kind of a key point to the state revolving funds. Each state gets to decide how they divvy up their money. And I can't really emphasize this enough, and I'll keep coming back to this throughout the presentation. The key to understanding the SRF program is understanding that there are a few aspects that hold true for all states, but most of the details are up to each state to decide and work out for themselves. And states have flexibility to promote the kinds of activities they want to see more of, like targeting financial resources to a specific community, customizing loan terms to meet the needs of small and disadvantaged communities, providing further financial assistance through subsidization, like grants, principal forgiveness, negative interest rates, and also allows them to target green infrastructure, water and energy efficiency improvements, and they can also choose to address emerging contaminant projects according to state-determined guidelines. Next slide. So that's the kind of big, broad overview of the Clean Water SRF. Now we're going to get into project eligibilities. So this is kind of the question that we're going to start with. You've decided that a low interest loan with a long payback period would suit your system's needs. What comes next? A key first question is, can the SRF fund my project at all? Go ahead and next slide. So there are a couple ways to get at this. Project, and I'm going to come back to this, project eligibilities vary greatly between the clean water and drinking water SRFs. Again, they have different founding legislation, Clean Water Act versus Drinking Water Act. Each federal SRF program has its own governing legislation, and it's often actually implemented by different agencies at the state level. So, you know, you have a Clean Water SRF program and a Drinking Water SRF program for your state. However, these programs are not always administered by the same office or even the same department. Usually they fall under your state's environmental department, but they might be different branches of that department. So it's important to get familiar with each, if you're working in a particular state, with your state's, the way that your clean water and drinking water SRFs are administered. There are 11 eligible project types for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and those types are listed here. We're going to go into each of these project types in a little more detail. Different entities to keep in mind, different entities. So we're talking about municipal, intermunicipal, interstate or state agencies, public, private, nonprofit entities. Different entities are eligible for different types of projects. So this is something to keep in mind as we move through this, to know which kind of project type generally you're looking at, and also who is eligible to apply. It's not always public and municipal entities. Sometimes it's nonprofit. There are some cases in which private entities can apply for SRF. So there's a lot of nuance and flexibility there. Next slide. So today our presentation on eligibilities is really going to be organized by which section of the Clean Water Act each kind of eligible project type might fall under. So those numbers that you see on the color-coded boxes on the left refer to the different sections of the Clean Water Act that those eligibilities fall under. We're also going to take a look at the Green Project Reserve just really quickly here. I'm going to mention that states are required to have a plan for how they allocate Green Project Reserve funds, and these are federally granted funds. And there is, again, like I said earlier, there's a huge variety of ways that states choose to use these funds, and the Green Project Reserve is no exception. The best way to find out how your state intends to use these funds is to read your state's most current intended use plan, or IUP, which is updated annually. And so these Green Project Reserve eligible project types might fall under any one of the 4 categories to the left. You could have an energy efficiency project that falls under a publicly owned treatment works or Section 212 project. But the point is that the Green Project Reserve is there to expand the amount of eligibilities that are available for Clean Water State Revolving Fund money. At the technical assistance set aside is new to this Clean Water State Revolving Fund. That is a bipartisan infrastructure law or bill, a new aspect that is brought on by that funding, and that allows states to use funding from the Clean Water SRF to fund technical assistance efforts. So that's us. That's the EFCN. We are a technical assistance provider, and so there's funding for organizations like us to help smaller entities go ahead and apply for those SRF funds. Next slide. So first we're going to go into just a little bit more detail, publicly owned treatment works or eligibility section 212. Next slide. Eligible projects under section 212. Anything, if you think of publicly owned treatment works, think about like your traditional or standard wastewater, stormwater infrastructure, pipe, pump, conveyance, storage, and also what falls under this eligibility category are security measures at publicly owned treatment work. So that includes digital as well as physical security measures. So keep that in mind as well. When I talk about treatment works or gray infrastructure projects, I'm also just talking about any new construction, repair, or replacement projects. A couple of main goals with, sorry, can you go back just a slide? Thank you. A couple of main goals with this this section of the CWSRF eligibilities. Climate change mitigation is a big one. So the Clean Water State Revolving Funds are geared more toward water quality issues than water quantity issues. So with climate change mitigations and projects that deal with flooding issues, an important thing to keep in mind is that we're not talking about projects that are aimed at, say, preventing flooding of houses and neighborhoods necessarily. We're talking about projects that are geared toward dealing with water quality issues that come with flooding. So there's a little bit of nuance there, but it's important because the point of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is to address water quality issues. And that's kind of the main thing to take away from what projects are eligible is, does it have a water quality benefit? And that's something that you should be asking when you're thinking about Clean Water State Revolving Funds. We're also talking about energy conservation through water efficiency. So inflow and infiltration correction measures. We're trying to reduce loading on sewer systems. So in this case, you know, we could be looking at, this is where some of those what we might call quote unquote green projects could support a publicly owned treatment works issue, like reducing loading on those systems through downspouts, storm basins, rain gardens, and this type of thing. Next slide. So who can apply for Section 212 projects? This project type is limited to municipal and public borrowers only. So it's narrow in this way. No privately owned treatment work projects. There are cases in which perhaps a public entity could partner with a private or nonprofit entity. However, the main applicant of that project would still have to be the public or a municipal entity. An important aspect to keep in mind. Next slide. Okay, so we have a quick poll question here, just to check to make sure you're paying attention and you're here with us. A little puzzle for you. So this is a scenario in which a small brewery in a rural town currently discharges its waste to the municipal wastewater treatment facility. It's causing a very high and unpredictable slugs of nutrients into the plant, placing a strain on the facility. The municipality wants to require the brewery owner to install a pre-treatment device that would lessen the impact to the wastewater treatment facility. The municipality is even willing to take on the loan for the brewery since their state does not directly lend to private entities. Do you think this project is CWSRF eligible? And you can answer yes or no via the poll. So I'll give everyone a chance to respond to the poll here really quick.
Make sure you get your answers in. I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, Shannon, looks like 73% said yes and 27% said no.
All right. So let's return to that poll question here. So the thing to note here with this one is that the small brewery is not a public entity, right? So this is a private entity. However, it's causing issues in the wastewater treatment facility. So this is a bit of a tricky question, right? It's not super straightforward. The answer is no, the brewery cannot apply for CWSRF funds. However, if the pretreatment facility was located at the municipal wastewater treatment plant and that municipality took on like all of the like operations and maintenance costs, this project could be eligible. So this one is a yes and no. It's a bit tricky. It's no kind of based on the information we have here. However, if these two entities were to partner and work together, they could probably work out a situation in which the municipality applies for those funds in order to address the issue and perhaps partners with the brewery to manage this particular problem. Okay, and I'm going to pass it on to Haley, I believe, has the next section.
Thanks, Shannon. All right, we're going to go on to section 319. So in the 87 amendments of the Clean Water Drinking Act, they established section 319, which is the non-point source management program. And projects under this section are either known as non-point source projects or the green and natural infrastructure projects. And just to make sure we're all on the same page when we're talking about non-point source pollution, that occurs when you have rainfall or irrigation and that water's running over land and picking up pollutants and contaminants and then carrying those into bodies of waters like rivers, lakes, streams. And obviously that kind of contamination can come, or pollutants can come from agriculture, forestry, urban areas, marinas, so large areas, and these pollutants contribute substantially to water quality degradation. And that's why the Clean Water SRF is interested in funding these kinds of projects. So the different categories of this section are listed on screen here. We have green stormwater infrastructure, agricultural best management practices, resource extraction, decentralized wastewater treatment, contaminated sites, landfills, habitat protection and restoration, and silviculture. Those are the ones that I'll go into more detail. The bottom row here, surface water protection and restoration, groundwater protection and restoration are kind of covered in the top two row categories, but projects for those would be like protecting or restoring aquifers, any kind of water conservation or water reuse. Also, land acquisition or water rights would also fall into this category. And then with desalination, we won't go too much into that because a lot of the country, it's not as relevant to them, but projects that would fall under this category would be the treatment or disposal of brine or treatment and reinjection of brackish groundwater. So when we're talking about 319 projects, there's a lot of options here. It's a pretty broad category. And there's a lot of flexibility with this section. It has the potential to fund more innovative projects as long as water quality improvement can be demonstrated, and that's key. And unlike the 212 projects that Shannon was talking about, borrowers can be any kind of borrower. So that could be nonprofit organizations, for-profit entities, even individual homeowners or citizen groups. But there is a caveat to that, which is that most states do restrict borrowers, the type of borrower. So a lot of them still decide that they only want municipalities or utilities. So it's going to depend on your state, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, but there are some states that do allow for any kind of borrower under this section. And what's beneficial about 319 is that you have more creative options for repayment. So of course, you have the traditional taxes or fees that you could use for repayment, but there are more options. So like the recreational fees from fishing licenses or park entrances, even donations or dues made to nonprofit organizations or business revenues, fees paid by developers, all of those are potential avenues of repayment for you under 319 that are not necessarily available under other sections. And in 2021, about 38 million was allocated to this section for CWSRF. We anticipate that it's going to be more and more because of the BIL funding. But there's always this push and pull with this section because the CWSRF is pretty rooted in gray infrastructure. These programs are often still fairly engineering heavy because the fund started out with construction and then it's evolved into more complex programs. But the good news is that more states have moved towards Nonpoint Source and have gotten creative with their projects and have also mixed green and gray infrastructure projects. So that may be one of the questions that you have if you're looking at a project that has green and gray infrastructure. So maybe some of the project falls under 319 and some of it falls under a different section. That can still be one single application that you turn into your SRF program. And usually what they'll do is they'll just have different experts come and review the different components. It depends how well staffed your state SRF is, but a lot of them have different review committees depending on the section that the program falls under. So if it's several sections, they'll just bring other people in so you're not having to submit several different applications. All right, let's go into some more specifics about the different categories that I showed you at the start. So for green infrastructure projects, that can be completely new installation of green infrastructure, or it can be replacing your gray infrastructure with some type of green infrastructure. And I have a couple examples on the screen. It's absolutely by no means an exhaustive list, but you can see that projects that are technically gray, but kind of do some traditional stormwater or green infrastructure processes do still fall under this 319 category. We also have more natural infrastructure, so that would be your wetland, riparian, shoreline protection or restoration projects. There's also establishment or restoration of urban tree canopy that would fall under 319 projects. And then more engineered green, that's probably what you're thinking of when you're thinking of green infrastructure. That's your permeable pavements, bioretention, bioswales, infiltration basins, green roofs, all of that fall under green eligible green infrastructure projects. Now, you need to always think about the goal when it comes to 319 projects, which is water quality. So pollutant load reduction, runoff reduction, all sorts of projects that's the ultimate goal. Those will be funded, but projects that address flooding concerns or maybe removal of flow from like a stream channel, those are generally not funded because they're not addressing the underlying water quality issue. If you can make a business case and in your application to address some sort of funding that is related to water quality, or excuse me, some sort of flooding that's related to water quality, then maybe those can be funded. But because this is such a broad category, always go back and ask yourself if the underlying decision that you're making to have this project funded is water quality related, and that will be a good barometer for you to determine whether that's going to be funded. So do a little example here. So this example comes from the city of Binghamton, which is in New York, and the city hall had a roof that needed to be replaced. It was just a regular roof, but it was leaking and had caused significant damage within the building. And so they applied through 319, the CWSRF 319 section, to install a green roof, stormwater planters, and a stormwater harvest and reuse system. And the goal here was to treat and store stormwater on site for municipal operations. So their fire department and their public works department could utilize that water as a source. And the project in total was 2.1 million, but they were able to fund 1.6 million from the CWSRF. And they found that with this project, they now had less volumetric flow during heavy rain events entering their combined sewer. And in the past, this kind of flow would have triggered a combined sewer overflow into the river. So there's your water quality connection again. And that's something that they put in their application to justify this project under 319. And overall, this project had over 22,000 square feet of plants, and it was able to absorb 325,000 gallons of rainwater each year. Right, the next category under Section 319 is decentralized wastewater treatment. So that's anything from on-site septic systems to what's known as cluster systems, so serving a cluster of homes. And eligible projects here would be new septic system installation, repair and replacement projects, even converting cesspools to septic. That's an option as well. And as Shannon mentioned, there are certain things that can't be funded under CWSRF. So your planning, your design and construction here, all of those can be funded, but O&M cannot be funded through this mechanism. And that's across the board for any of these categories. So just keep that in mind. Planning, design, construction, repair, replacement, all good, can be funded. O&M unfortunately cannot. So this funding mechanism is pretty important because about 1 in 5 households in the US have a septic system. And unfortunately, right now, only 11 out of the 51 states have used the CWSRF for septic projects. Now, this number is from 2020, so hopefully a couple more have since then, but still, it's underutilized. However, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Ohio are the states that have done the majority of these projects. So if you are on from one of these states and are interested, I would go look at that IUP and know that it's more likely if you're in these states that these kinds of projects will be funded. So might as well go for it. EPA does have a document for financing on-site systems. Right now, it's only valuable to a limited number of states, but I expect that that will grow, and that's a resource that we can share with you all. Why a lot of states aren't utilizing this funding for septic systems is because they can't or won't loan to individuals. So you can't even get to the stage of applying for this type of project as an individual sometimes. So that's state specific. But we can help you. We'll talk more at the end about technical assistance we provide. If you want to know specifics about your state, we're happy to help with that research and provide additional information that's state specific for you. So the next category is agricultural best management practices. And this is a massive category, and you're going to see some overlap here with other categories that happens often with 319 projects. But I think this is also probably the first category that you'll learn about some projects that you wouldn't think would be able to be funded under 319. And I broke it down into smaller categories for you guys. So we have sediment control projects, cropland activity projects, and AFO activity projects. That would be your animal feeding operations. So sediment control projects that would qualify are terraces, diversions, installing buffer and filter strips or any kind of stream bank stabilizations. Ones that also qualify that might be surprising to you are manure injection equipment or manure spreaders, any kind of installation of water efficient irrigation. Also, in terms of AFO activities, that could be livestock or milk house waste management systems, installing that, installing manure contaminant structures, even installing fence that's going to keep your animals out of water bodies. Again, that is protecting water quality, so that's why a project like that would qualify. If you have any old or abandoned wells on your property that might have contaminants in the area. That's just an easier way for contaminants to get into groundwater. So well sealing is an option for funding under this category. All right, moving right along, there's also resource extraction contaminated sites and landfill projects that can be funded. So in this category, it's really anything that is remediating or preventing contamination, anything that's preventing any kind of chemical from entering into the aquifer. So that could be projects of cleaning up mining, quarrying, or oil and gas operations, also cleanup from fracking. In terms of contaminated sites, that could be brownfield or Superfund contamination cleanups. Just so we're on the same page, a brownfield site is essentially a property where contamination is present and it may complicate future use. Superfund's sort of the next level of that, where contamination at the site escalates or may pose a threat to life. And then we also have underground storage tanks, and removal or cleanup of those tanks is also eligible under 319 funding. And lastly, landfills. So the closure of landfills or landfill leachate and treatment, those are additional projects that you could potentially fund. The next category is habitat protection and restoration, another very, very broad category that has some overlap with some of the categories I have already talked about, but that could be land preservation, forest restoration or reforestation, wetland restoration, riparian protection. I've broken it down into smaller categories for you. So when we talk about shoreline activities that could be funded, that kind of harkens back to the green infrastructure, so your swales, your filter strips, but that's also wetland development and restoration or reestablishment of riparian vegetation. When we talk about water control structures under this category, that's more removal of gray infrastructure, so dam removal or culvert removal. In-stream activities, this one might surprise you. So besides removal of contaminated sediment or reestablishing aquatic vegetation, you can actually also fund projects like restoring oyster and mussel beds. You can also fund projects like fisheries and shellfish restocking or restoration, and even establishing artificial reefs. Those would all qualify, again, with the big caveat of depending on your state. And then lastly, invasive species control. So any kind of project or equipment to remove or prevent invasive species spread will also be something that could be funded in this category. The last one I'll talk about is silviculture, and this is your forestry activities. So timber thinning and harvesting, site preparation for tree planting, anything like that. It could potentially be land purchase. Again, other examples that we've kind of touched on, the erosion control, the stream bank stabilization, revegetation of harvested areas. Anybody from New Mexico, we had our largest wildfire in the state last year. And so there's a lot of sediment and contaminants that were going into reservoirs in the area. So there are CWSRF funds are available for work to help prevent that in the forest area, because again, water quality, it's all impacting the reservoir there. So forest activities can also be funded because it protects water quality. So I have another example here. It's not related to silviculture, but it does help us transition sort of into our 320, which is the next section we'll talk about. But I also picked this example because it has a ton of cooperating entities. And the great thing about 319 projects is that there is a lot of flexibility in borrowers. So you can have a lot of different project partners involved, and a lot of different funding agencies can also help support your project besides just 319. So this example comes from Missouri and the Deer Creek watershed, which you see the map of here on your screen, and the Deer Creek runs through the center here, and it drains approximately 37 square miles of the county. And one of the issues here is that single family homes make up 72% of the land use in the watershed, and a lot of them are on septic systems. And so when we talk about state-specific guidelines, they can also have specific priorities. So for example, Missouri, their program guidance for Section 319 is to focus on development and implementation of watershed-based plans to address impaired waters with a goal of restoring water quality. So they're focusing specifically on development and implementation of watershed plans. And that's what this project was. It was watershed planning, so updating and implementing a couple projects after updating that watershed plan. So the Deer Creek watershed, it faced a lot of water quality threats from runoff. There was a lot of debris and trash, also sediment from stream bed and bank erosions, and pollutants associated with combined sewer overflows. It was also listed on Missouri's impaired water list for E. coli and chloride due to Nonpoint Source urban runoff and storm sewer overflows. So the project included a complete technical update of the watershed management plan and focused on 70 installations that they're going to install through rainscaping. That's sort of a broad term for a lot of different types of green infrastructure like bioretention, filter strips, etc. And the goal is obviously to improve water quality through this project, but they also had a ton of entities that went in on this one. So they had the Deer Creek Watershed Alliance, Missouri Botanical Gardens, the County Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District, the Watershed Coalition, 20 local municipalities, Washington University, Missouri Department of Conservation, and a lot of local landowners as well. So 319 projects often bring about several different partnerships, and that's one of the benefits of them. I will say too, some states are, I believe New Hampshire might be one of them, are requiring you to have some sort of watershed plan, and that has to be created, and projects or projects listed in that watershed plan, and then you can apply for those projects to be funded, and you can also apply to be reimbursed for the creation of your watershed plan. So that's a little bit opposite. You're not applying for money to create the watershed plan. You actually have to create that first before applying for a project that is within that plan, and then they could also reimburse you for that plan. That's very state specific, but there's a lot of nuances like that that are occurring for 319 projects that we can help you look into for your specific state. So why don't SRFs fund more non-point source projects? We touched on a couple of those reasons, but many of the programs right now only fund quote unquote traditional projects. So those the gray infrastructure projects. And unfortunately, I would say more states than not cannot fund nonprofit or private borrowers directly. So that cuts out some of the projects that I talked about here unless you can get creative. There is somewhat of a bias towards point source and maybe an unwarranted perceived lack of demand for non-point source, but I think that can change. There's also a lack of understanding of value by some of the borrowers. I think that can change as well. And then, like a lot of state agencies, there's also capacity challenges at the state level in terms of project development and review, which sometimes mean that the point source projects get priority over the non-point source. But hopefully with the BIL money coming in, there'll be more of these projects that are funded. So I'm going to very briefly touch on section 320. I'm not going to go as in depth because there's a ton of overlap between 320 and 319. And there's also, I believe it's 122 that also looks at watersheds. Again, because there's so much overlap, and since 319 was the most broad, I went with that, but we're happy to go into more detail about other section and the eligibilities if you're interested. So this section is the National Estuary Program, Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plans. That's a mouthful, but basically EPA created this program, the National Estuary Program, to protect and restore the water quality and ecological integrity of estuaries of national significance. So there are currently 28 of them, and they're located all over along the Atlantic, Gulf, and Pacific coasts, as well as in Puerto Rico. And then these estuary programs were charged with developing and implementing a comprehensive conservation and management plan that establishes various priorities for activities, research, and funding for the estuary. So it kind of serves as this blueprint guide, and there's a lot of activities like water quality, habitat, fish and wildlife, land use, pathogens that fall under these plans, which is why there's, I mean, what I just listed, I basically listed in 319 as well. So that's why there's a lot of overlap. But to just give you a better idea, it's not, even though it's only 28 national estuaries, you can see it covers a fair part of the US. So there is potentially a high likelihood that where your community falls within one of these 28 estuaries, and the CWSRF can provide assistance for the development and implementation of that CCM plan. And this includes implementation of water quality improvement projects within the NEP study area and potentially in the larger surrounding watershed if you can show correlation. And these projects can be publicly or privately owned, and they can serve public or private purposes. So that's all I'm going to go in for the sake of time on 320, but happy to send additional information. Also, the source on the slide here for this map is also a great handout that EPA created that provides additional detail on 320. And we will be providing the slides. It's in that handout section. So again, you don't need to quickly write this down. Okay, so let's do another poll question here. A municipality wants to eliminate downspouts that are connected to combined sewer systems to reduce combined sewer overflow events. The solution is to install new pervious pavement in alleys, create green space, and direct the downspouts to those areas which will allow for infiltration. Additionally, the municipality will work with a nonprofit to install playground equipment, creating outdoor space in an under-resourced community. Which parts of this project are loan eligible? So Kristen's going to give you guys a couple options. Unfortunately, I can't see them. So Kristen, if you want to read them out, people can read them themselves and we'll see what you guys think.
Yeah, so you can choose multiple answers for this one. The answer options are the pervious pavement, the planting of green space, downspout disconnection, and playground equipment. And I'll give you guys some time to review the question and choose your answers. All right, go ahead and get those answers in. I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, and it looks like over 80% chose the first three and only 5% chose the playground equipment.
Great. Yes, absolutely. That means you guys are understanding. So the other three are projects that can be funded under 319. They're all related either to green infrastructure or the downspout does relate to water quality. So you could make a business case and justification for any of those. Unfortunately, the playground equipment is not going to help water quality in any way, but that doesn't mean that, you know, if you want this to be part of your project, there are other sources of funding, not CWSRF, but that you can combine with the 319 funding to make that an option. All right, so we'll finish up with some other Clean Water SRF resources. Again, no need to scribble these down quickly. They'll be provided in the slides, but all of the state contacts for the SRF, CWSRF programs are provided by EPA via this website. We also have regional office information with that website. The Environmental Finance Center Network, which is the picture that you see on the screen here, does funding tables for each state. So we don't just focus on DWSRF or CWSRF when it comes to these funding tables. We provide a list of funding sources for each state, and we talk about the purpose of the funds, how to apply. We give you the website and also the contact information. But for each state, we do have a section for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So that's a resource that you guys, I highly recommend use. And then EPA also has a general Clean Water SRF fact sheet that can be helpful. And we have what we call the SRF Info Hub, and the website's right there. And so what we've done is we have this map, and you can click on any of these states to find additional SRF funding information. So in this case, if you clicked on Iowa, it would take you to a page that looks like this. We do have a lot of PDFs that you can directly download, but we've also linked the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, so you can easily get to it. I will say it's surprising with some states when you Google their SRF funding, you would think that it'd be pretty simple to get to their eligibilities or their applications or descriptions of projects. Sometimes that's not the case. So this is an easy way to ensure you're at least getting to the right web page. EPA also has a list of what types of projects that can be funded through the Clean Water SRF. These are all eligible projects under the Clean Water Act. Again, your state might be taking all of those eligibilities and narrowing them down. So you'll have to check with your state, but if you're looking for just a broad list of the types of projects that are eligible, you can look on the EPA website. And then, as I mentioned before, we do provide free assistance under this grant that we have. So any of you that have very state-specific questions, I don't know if we'll be able to answer them on this webinar, but we can absolutely work with you to find the answer in your state and give you additional resources from your state to find out if your project's eligible, or if you know your project is eligible. We can help you start to create that funding application and look over the IUPs to see what other past projects have been funded to try to make yours the most competitive. And that can be assistance remote or in person, because we are a network and we have several different centers around the country. One might be in your state. We can provide in-person assistance, or we've been very successful providing remote assistance over the phone or via Zoom or Teams. And it's not just on funding. We do a large variety of topics for technical, managerial, and financial assistance. Some are on your screen right now, but that's definitely not the exhaustive list. You can either email us or put your contact information in the chat right now, and we're happy to reach out. Or your third option is to go to our website, the EFCN website, where we have that Get Help tab, as you can see there. If you click on it, there's a very short form. I promise it's not very long. It's basically your name, title, and just contact information, and letting us know a brief summary of the type of assistance that you're interested in or that you need help with. And then finally, just a reminder that this is part of a series. So today was the what types of projects are eligible for funding. On June 15th, we're going to be doing another webinar on assessing financial condition to prepare for your SRF application. As Shannon mentioned, you can find all of that information on our website under the Training and Events tab. And that's where you can also get the recordings, download slides, and register for future webinars. And with that, we can get into the chat portion. I am running 5 minutes behind, but we can stay on a little bit longer if people have additional questions, or please feel free to contact us.
Thank you, Haley. All right, so we do have a couple of questions that came in. So while we're answering these, make sure that you do get your questions in if you have one. The first question is, can you use the 319 projects to meet green requirements in the CWSRF?
To meet green requirements. If they mean like regulation wise, then yes, if that pertains to water quality. So it always goes back to that. So if you need to make to meet some sort of green regulation and you need to install a certain amount of green infrastructure, maybe it's a city ordinance or something like that. If it is improving water quality and you can make a case for that, then absolutely. But if I'm misinterpreting what you mean by green requirements, please clarify, or feel free to email me as well. But I think that's what you mean.
Great, and if we get a clarification at all, I will make sure to mention it. Next question, if the municipality operated the pre-treatment unit, which I think this goes back to the first poll question, if the municipality operated the pre-treatment unit, could it be located closer downstream to the brewery?
I think that's a really interesting question. So to my understanding, and this is again, this is a state specific thing, but a lot of states will will say that in my experience, most states will say that the project has to be physically located where on like land where the treatment facility is located, or on an easement that the treatment facility like has secured. Like these, like legally it has to be, the land has to be tied to the treatment facility. Now, that's a general response. I would say that like for these types of, this type of nuance is definitely a state level decision, so it's going to vary. But I think that that question is good because it gets at a detail that I think a lot of people often overlook with projects, which is with physically where is it located, and the answer is that it will depend.
Awesome, thank you, Shannon. And the next question is, a water distribution system can only funding be used to treat wells high in nitrates due to septic systems?
Can you repeat that question again?
As a water distribution system only, can funding be used to treat wells high in nitrates due to septic systems?
I don't believe it could be used. You could definitely apply for funding to help prevent contamination of the well. So replacing septic systems, or potentially if you need to seal the well, if you have to go to another source. In terms of actually treating the well water, because that then moves into the drinking water SRF, I think you could find funding from drinking water SRF, but it wouldn't be clean water SRF funding.
All right. A huge thank you to both Haley and Shannon for sharing their expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following the webinar so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics that are important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.